What if Kim Wilde had an early 90s rave phase? That's the alternative universe scenario we'll be considering on this week's What If, How, and Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and each Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe scenario in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Kids in America by Kim Wilde, and I tried to reimagine that in an early 90s rave music style. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
Bright lights and music is fast. Good boy, don't check on your watch, not another glance. I'm not leaving now, honey, not a chance. Hot shot, shot, give me no problems. Much later, baby, you'll be saying never mind. You know life is cruel, life is never kind. Time to make a new story. Time to gravity for free. We're the kids in America. We're the kids in America. Everybody lives for the music around.
Now this week's video is actually a viewer request. It came from my old mate Leo quite a while ago, so glad I finally managed to get around to it. But I was really happy when he asked for this because I've long been a Kim Wilde fan. I definitely had in the back of my mind that I'd like to do something with one of her songs. Growing up, I was definitely always more inclined to be a rock fan even before I was actively buying my own records. I was just interested in guitars. I wanted to listen to guitar-based music, but even so, always kind of had a soft spot for Kim Wilde. Always thought she was kind of great. First thing I particularly remember was that high energy cover version of You Keep Me Hanging On by the Supremes that she did, which I just thought was amazing at the time. I'd never heard the original when I was that age, but I just thought that was a brilliant song. And then some of the stuff that she did just in the few years after that as well, like some of that stuff from the early 90s, You Came, that kind of stuff, when everything went a bit more sort of pop rock. Some great songs there too. And so yeah, even while I was listening to Megadeth or Metallica or whatever, I still definitely had a proper soft spot for Kim. Outside of Kids in America, I'm not sure how well remembered she is in the rest of the world, but if you don't know, I would consider her to be proper British pop royalty, right down to being part of a British pop dynasty. She's the daughter of Marty Wilde, who was one of the UK's original generation of rock and rollers back in the 50s. It was part of the management stable of Larry Parnes, who was this extremely flamboyant kind of Svengali manager who had a stable of these handsome young rock and roll boys who he gave these wild stage names to. So as well as Marty Wilde, you obviously had Billy Fury, Vince Eager, Duffy Power, and yeah, Marty Wilde obviously was one of those guys. Like the rest of Parnes' stable, he didn't have a particularly long-lasting initial career as a rocker, but did carry on in music and actually ended up becoming a pretty distinguished songwriter. When he had kids, they naturally grew up in this musical household and were sort of at least encouraged to get into music. So first off, his son Ricky had a go at being a pop star, and I think actually Kim's first appearance on record was performing backing vocals on one of Ricky's records from the early 70s, but then a few years later it was Kim's turn. I think the whole approach to presenting Kim Wilde when she first sort of burst out into the scene was really astute. They could absolutely have just made her a generic teeny bopper, but instead Marty and Kim's brother Ricky, who were her principal songwriters and who really shaped the sound of those records, they really leaned into a lot of cooler, slightly more underground influences. And to some extent they must have been thinking of Blondie and figuring they could present Kim as a bit of a UK Deborah Harry. But in terms of the songs they were writing, they were leaning into bits of punky and new wavy stuff. They were leaning into early electro pop as well. So all the stuff has a quite attitudinal, punky energy, and also this really cool underpinning of synthy stuff. So still great, super catchy pop songs, but with this musical underpinning that sounds like something off, I don't know, the first Ultravox album, something like that. So not your average happy-go-lucky top 40 pop fodder, really. And that first album that features Kids in America is an absolute classic. Every track on it for me is a total winner. The funny thing is, having said that they had these cool contemporary influences, the backing band on the first album was about as far from edgy, punky stuff as you could get, because she was actually backed on that record by the Enid, the progressive rock band. I think the deal was that they were recording in the studio that the band actually owned, and I guess it being 1981, they were probably pretty down on their luck, so making money from hiring out the studio and hiring out their services as a backing group. But they do a cracking job. I mean, when she was doing TV appearances for those first album singles, she was appearing with her live band of all these snotty looking young handsome punks, and I don't think you'd ever guessed just from listening to it that rather than those guys playing the music on the album that it was actually this bunch of old prog hippies. But there you go. And yeah, she's just a British pop legend, as I say. She's kept going. She's done some interesting stuff as well. She appeared in the West End run of The Who's Tommy when that became a West End musical, and she's even diversified into TV gardening shows, that kind of thing. So all over the place, really. I just think she's probably pretty underappreciated nowadays, given the extent of her contribution to British pop. I mean, I think she probably had the most hit singles of any British female singer in the 1980s, and that's a pretty astonishing achievement, but she doesn't really get talked about in the revered terms that a bunch of her contemporaries do, which is a real shame, because there's a load of good stuff there. But I mean, even if she had only ever done Kids in America, she still deserved to be celebrated for that, because that's just obviously a total classic. So when Leo got in touch to suggest I did a Kim Wilde song in the style of early 90s rave, it just sounded like a really fun challenge. It's especially challenging for me because, as I say, lifelong rock guy from being a little kid, my understanding and knowledge of dance music is so negligible. I allow myself a week to put these things together, and there was no way I was going to get from my utter ignorance to actually having a working knowledge of early 90s rave culture within a week. So I've just been kind of winging it based on what little bits and bobs I remember from that time. I had plenty of friends who were getting excited about those Prodigy records and about the Shaman, you know, Move Any Mountain and Charlie and all these records, and at the time I was just, I don't know what this is, no idea what this music is. So yeah, I've just never really quite engaged with it. I was into metal, then I was into punk, and missed all the various points where I could have found a good crossover point. I never really crossed over into the Prodigy when they were doing their kind of punky thing with Giz Butt and guitar. Never really got into any of the metal stuff that edges over into more electronic stuff. So yeah, it's just remained a bit of a mystery to me, really. Even though the more I got into punk, the more I kind of came to realise that actually that early 90s rave scene has so many links back to the 80s anarcho-punk scene. A lot of it is still a continuation of the same spirit that goes back to the kind of anarchist roots of the free festival scene and people like Hawkwind in the late 60s and into the 70s, and then Crass, and then that whole 80s kind of squat punk scene. And a lot of the people who were active in the early rave scene and putting together these warehouse parties or these parties in fields were absolutely people who come out of that 80s squatter punk scene. I think for all that I've always wanted to be open-minded about music, and I've always considered myself to be reasonably open-minded about music, there's always been a little bit of a reactionary part of my mind that has heard the majority of dance records that I hear and gone, it's just noise, or it's just some repetitive beats. And it wasn't really until I started trying to dissect things and figure out how these things work that I actually appreciated how much more than just some repetitive beats this stuff is. So definitely been an eye-opening week for me, this, and quite humbling. So yeah, the alternative universe scenario that I came up with to explain this week's track was, in this alternative universe, it's 1991. Kim Wilde is a little bit depressed. She's a bit in the career doldrums. Her 1990 album had not sold tremendously well. It's been a little bit of commercial disappointment, so she's not too sure what she's going to do next. And one of her mates is aware that she's a bit down in the dumps, so she gets in touch and says, you know what will cheer you up, let's go out clubbing. And Kim agrees, thinking, oh yeah, we'll just be going out to somewhere in London, one of our regular haunts. But it turns out that they're not going to London at all. They're going to go all the way to this club in Stoke-on-Trent. She's thinking, Stoke-on-Trent, what the hell's there? So they end up at this club called Shelley's Laser Dome. Kim's definitely feeling some trepidation about going to this weird club very far from home, but she walks in and is immediately dropped just into the heart of the UK rave scene, and she's completely captivated by the euphoric energy and the light show and this amazing hypnotic pulsating music, and she's so taken with it that she stays right the way through the night, right until the lights finally come on, and gets talking to the resident DJ, Dave Seaman, and he's pretty impressed that Kim Wilde's come to visit this club that he's DJing at, and they get chatting and he's telling her all about the music, and she's expressing an interest in doing something like this herself, so he gives her the contact details of some young, hungry, up-and-coming producer who he's aware of, and she gets in touch with this guy, and after chatting about it a bit, they decide that he's gonna take Kids in America, her debut hit, and give it a radical remix to reinvent it for this new rave generation. And the resulting record is both a chart smash and also a major favourite in clubs and warehouse parties across the UK, and puts Kim right back at the centre of cultural relevance. So after I'd come up with this scenario, I had quite a lot to live up to, considering I had absolutely no idea how to make a rave record. I did attempt to watch a couple of bits and bobs on YouTube with people showing how they produced tracks in various rave styles, but most of it involved using equipment that I don't have, and I didn't really know how to go about simulating that. So I mainly just set about attempting to piece together bits and bobs that I remember from assorted different records from the 90s, mainly from memory. I'd imagine if I was actually a 90s rave producer and I had to do something with Kids in America, I'd have probably just taken a couple of vocal phrases and just used them as a repeating hook and jettisoned most of the rest of the song. But I really wanted to keep the song intact, didn't really want to chop it up too much, so I've done that, and I've just kind of tried to work in as many rave trademarks as I could conjure up around that. So the first thing I did was just sync up the lead vocal to the grid and drop that in there. It's already a pretty up-tempo song, but I did speed it up a little bit more because I wanted it to be pretty frantic. I was thinking of things like Outer Space by The Prodigy, stuff like that. I kind of wanted to capture some of that manic energy. And then obviously the next thing I needed was just some drums. Now, not knowing my way around different dance music subgenres, I know I remember some records that have very clearly drum machine rhythms and mainly rely on a sort of fall on the floor stomping bass drum, but then others that have more like sped up hip hop rhythms, break beats or whatever. I kind of wanted to go more along those lines. It's something that interests me quite a lot more, so I basically created 4 different drum patterns that I could combine and swap out between. So there are 3 that are just programmed drum patterns that I just played on a MIDI keyboard. 2 of them are using standard drum machine sounds, and then one's using an acoustic kit sound with kind of a retro 60s feel, so that's maybe meant to sound a bit more like it's sampled from an old 60s soul or funk record, was kind of what I was aiming for. And then the 4th pattern, I thought most of this stuff was probably based on samples back in the day, so I thought I should at least use some samples. So the 4th drum pattern is actually a little section from Joe McCarthy's Ghost by the Minutemen, which I chopped up a bit to make it different from how it is on the original record. So I just combine those 4 patterns in different ways throughout to mark out the different sections. Went for bass next, so a couple of different synth bass sounds on there. I found this really cool, extremely subby synth bass sound that I use for the main sound all the way through. And then I've got another one that's a much more aggressive saw wave sound that isn't there all the way through, but just pops up to add punctuation to different bits. Next step was to get some chordal stuff on there to just fill out the sound a bit. So I've got a pair of synth pads just panned pretty hard left and right, 2 different complementary sounds playing these kind of quite floaty, ethereal chords that just fill up a bit of sonic space there. And then later on, for a bit more of a chordal texture, I brought in a bit of a kind of house piano part. Don't know if it really fits with the rest of it, but I liked it. so I put it in there. I just used the standard GarageBand piano sound, but then gave it a bit of a kind of slightly wonky chorus to make it just sound a little bit detuned, sort of maybe like it's gone through a cheap sampler. And then really it's just loads more synths, so just playing various little riffs and repeated motifs that come round at different points. So some quite aggressive, more kind of forthright, blaring synth riffs, and then also there's a little chimey, slightly haunting thing that just lurks in the background on some of the verses as well, just providing different textures, marking out the different sections a bit. Also added just a couple of non-musical sound effects in there. There's a little kind of synthesized thing that sounds a bit like an alarm going off, which I thought was quite a sort of rave-friendly sound, so that's rhythmically happening in the background in a couple of places. And a few swells and bass bombs, that kind of thing, just happening to punctuate different sections of the song too. And then the one other thing that I thought was probably needed was just a little speech sample, because you'd hear that so often repeated kind of phrase that's used as a hook, quite often taken from a hip-hop record or something. Prodigy were really fond of doing that, and that's kind of one of my main reference points. So it being Kids in America, I thought, well, I'd quite like to have some kind of line about America. So we've got Ice Cube from America's Most Wanted just saying it's the American way, sped up until he's in rhythm. So with chipmunky little Ice Cube there just kind of chirping away in the background too. It certainly came out better than I was expecting it to, with me not knowing what I was doing, but I'm sure if you were actually a fan of any kind of rave music, you'll probably have a list of things that I've done wrong, so I'll look forward to hearing what your critiques are. And then for the video, as ever, I just started with some decent performance footage of Kim doing the song. I managed to find some early 90s performance footage, so that was perfect. And then as luck would have it, someone's actually uploaded hours and hours of footage of people dancing in Shelley's Laserdome to YouTube, so I just used a bunch of that. So we've got lots of very authentic early 90s ravers just doing their thing, having a great time, bits of the light show as well. And then as a final touch, I just mocked up a few posters to just put Kim in that early 90s kind of rave-ish scene as well, just to suggest that she was there and she was getting involved in that style of music too. So I hope you enjoyed it. It was so much fun to do this one. It was a massive challenge for me because I'm completely clueless about it, but really stretched me a bit, which I definitely enjoyed. So let me know what you think down in the comments. If you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe. That always really helps. If you've got any suggestions of songs or artists or genres you'd like me to get involved with, please do let me know. That would be great. But yeah, otherwise that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.